Long before modern supermarkets, refrigeration, or supply chains connected every corner of America, thousands of miners lived in some of the most remote places on the continent. They traveled deep into mountains, far beyond established towns, far beyond reliable roads, and often far beyond regular access to fresh food. Yet every morning they still had to eat, because searching for gold, silver, and other minerals demanded enormous amounts of energy. A miner could spend 10, 12, even 14 hours working underground or breaking rock under the open sky. Without enough calories, survival became difficult. Without reliable food, entire mining camps could collapse. One of the most important foods in these isolated communities was something surprisingly simple: salt pork. Today, many people would struggle to imagine building an entire diet around heavily salted pork. But during the 19th century, it became one of the foundations of frontier life. The reason was simple: it lasted. Long before refrigeration, preserving meat presented a major challenge. Fresh pork spoiled quickly, especially during warm weather. Salt solved that problem. Large quantities of pork could be packed in salt and stored for extended periods, months in many cases. That made it ideal for transportation into remote mining regions where fresh supplies were difficult to obtain. A barrel of salt pork could travel hundreds of miles by wagon, mule, or riverboat, and once it arrived, miners knew they could depend on it. Dependability mattered. Mining camps were unpredictable places. Some camps appeared almost overnight after a major discovery. Thousands of people could arrive within weeks. Housing was often crude. Stores were limited. Supply deliveries could be delayed by weather, distance, or dangerous terrain. Under those conditions, foods that lasted became incredibly valuable. Salt pork was rarely exciting. Few people considered it a delicacy. Yet it filled stomachs, and in mining camps, that often mattered more than flavor. The meat appeared in countless meals, cooked by itself, mixed into beans, added to stews, combined with bread. Almost every camp cook found ways to stretch it as far as possible, because feeding hungry miners was a constant challenge. Many camps employed cooks whose entire job revolved around transforming simple ingredients into filling meals. A successful cook could become surprisingly respected. A bad cook might face constant complaints. Food had a direct impact on morale, and morale mattered when people worked in dangerous conditions every day. Mining itself was incredibly risky. Tunnel collapses, explosions, accidents, disease. A miner never knew what the day might bring. A hot meal at the end of a shift provided comfort in an otherwise uncertain world. Salt pork often played a central role in that meal. As America's mining industry expanded throughout the 19th century, millions of pounds of preserved meat flowed into frontier settlements. From California to Colorado, from Nevada to Montana, mining camps developed their own food traditions. Yet salt pork appeared almost everywhere. It became one of the few foods shared across nearly every mining region. Over time, however, technology changed everything. Railroads expanded, transportation improved, refrigeration became common, fresh foods became easier to obtain. The importance of salt pork gradually declined. What had once been a necessity became a choice, and eventually, many Americans stopped eating it altogether. Today, salt pork survives mostly as an ingredient in traditional recipes, yet its historical importance remains difficult to overstate.
For generations of miners, it represented something essential: reliability, a dependable source of food in places where little else could be guaranteed. It may not have been glamorous, it may not have been memorable, but for countless workers chasing fortunes beneath the mountains of the American West, salt pork helped make survival possible. And that alone earned it a permanent place in the history of America's mining camps.
If salt pork was the protein that helped sustain America's mining camps, then sourdough bread was the food that filled the empty space beside it. Few foods became more closely associated with frontier life. In fact, during the great mining booms of the 19th century, a miner's sourdough starter could become almost as valuable as his tools. That may sound strange today. After all, bread seems ordinary, something easily purchased from a grocery store, something most people rarely think about. But in isolated mining camps scattered across the American West, fresh bread was anything but ordinary. The challenge began with a simple problem. Yeast was difficult to obtain. Even when available, it often spoiled during long journeys into remote mining regions. Supply wagons could take weeks or even months to arrive, and if a shipment failed to appear, miners had to find another solution. Fortunately, they already had one: sourdough. Unlike commercial yeast, sourdough relied on naturally occurring wild yeast and bacteria. Once a starter was established, it could be maintained almost indefinitely. Feed it regularly, protect it from extreme temperatures, and it would continue producing bread for years. Some miners carried the same starter throughout entire mining seasons. Others passed it down to friends and family. A good starter became a prized possession, especially in isolated camps where dependable food was essential. The process required patience. Flour and water were mixed together and allowed to ferment naturally. Over time, wild yeast transformed the mixture into a living culture. That culture could then be used to make bread. The resulting loaves tasted slightly tangy and possessed a distinctive flavor unlike ordinary bread. Many miners grew so accustomed to the taste that they preferred it. And because the starter could be reused repeatedly, it provided a reliable source of bread without depending on outside supplies. In many camps, sourdough appeared at nearly every meal: breakfast, lunch, dinner. A thick slice of bread could help stretch limited food supplies. Combined with salt pork, beans, or stew, it provided much-needed calories for workers facing physically demanding days. Mining consumed enormous amounts of energy. Men spent hours digging tunnels, breaking rock, hauling ore, and operating primitive equipment. The work was exhausting. Food needed to be filling. Sourdough met that requirement perfectly. Its importance became especially clear during harsh winters. Many mining camps were located at high elevations, where snow could isolate entire communities for months. Roads became impassable, supply delivery stopped, fresh food disappeared. Under those conditions, sourdough helped bridge the gap between scarcity and survival. As long as flour remained available, bread could still be made, and as long as bread could be made, people could continue eating. This practical value helped create a unique culture around sourdough. During later gold rushes in places like Alaska and the Yukon, experienced miners were sometimes nicknamed sourdoughs. The term became a badge of honor, a symbol of experience and resilience. Someone who knew how to survive frontier life. Someone who had endured difficult conditions and learned how to adapt. The nickname reflected the deep connection between the bread and the people who depended upon it. As mining towns grew larger, bakeries began appearing in some settlements.
Fresh bread became easier to obtain, yet sourdough remained popular, partly because of tradition, partly because of taste, and partly because old habits die hard. Many miners trusted the methods that had carried them through difficult years. As the 20th century arrived, transportation improved dramatically. Railroads connected remote regions to major cities. Commercial bakeries expanded. Packaged yeast became widely available. The practical necessity of sourdough gradually diminished, but unlike many frontier foods, it never completely disappeared. Today, sourdough remains one of the most beloved breads in America. Artisan bakeries celebrate it. Home bakers carefully maintain starters. Restaurants proudly feature it on menus. Most people who enjoy it never realize they are eating a food that once helped sustain entire mining camps across the American West. Yet every loaf carries a small piece of that history, a reminder of a time when survival depended on ingenuity, when food required effort, and when something as simple as flour, water, and time could make the difference between hardship and endurance. For the miners who chased fortunes beneath the mountains, sourdough bread was never just bread. It was reliability, it was comfort, and sometimes it was the closest thing to home.
If there was one food that truly belonged to the working class of America's mining camps, it was beans. Not steak, not pie, not anything luxurious, just beans. Simple, inexpensive, and remarkably dependable. For thousands of miners scattered across the mountains of the American West, beans became one of the most important foods they would ever eat. The reason was straightforward. Beans solved nearly every problem faced by camp cooks. They were cheap, they were easy to transport, they could be stored for months without spoiling, and most importantly, they could feed large numbers of hungry men with relatively little expense. In a mining camp, that mattered enormously. Many camps appeared almost overnight. A rumor of gold or silver could attract hundreds of prospectors within days, sometimes thousands. Housing was often temporary, supplies were unpredictable, yet every one of those people expected to eat. Keeping a camp fed became a constant challenge. Beans offered a practical solution. Large sacks could be delivered by wagon and stored for extended periods. When needed, they could be soaked, cooked, and transformed into enormous meals capable of feeding entire crews. One pot might serve dozens of workers. A larger pot could feed hundreds. The meals themselves were rarely complicated. Beans often shared space with salt pork, onions, or whatever vegetables happened to be available. The ingredients simmered together for hours over open fires. By the end of the day, the result was filling, nutritious, and affordable. No one confused it with fine dining, but that was never the goal. The goal was survival, and beans excelled at keeping people alive. Mining required extraordinary amounts of physical effort. Workers spent long days underground, breathing dust and hauling heavy loads. Others worked above ground, crushing ore or operating machinery. The labor was relentless. A miner could burn thousands of calories during a single shift. Without substantial meals, exhaustion arrived quickly. Beans helped prevent that. Rich in protein and energy, they provided exactly what many workers needed. As mining camps expanded throughout California, Colorado, Nevada, Montana, and other western territories, beans became a common sight nearly everywhere. Different regions developed their own variations. Some cooks preferred thicker stews. Others added more meat when supplies allowed. Certain camps became known for particularly good cooks. Others developed reputations for meals people tried to avoid. Food quality mattered more than outsiders might expect. A skilled cook could dramatically improve morale. After spending 12 hours underground, a hot meal waiting at camp made a tremendous difference.
Many miners remembered good cooks long after they forgot how much gold they found. Beans also created a sense of community. Meals brought people together. Around long tables or campfires, workers shared stories, exchanged rumors, and discussed new discoveries. Some talked about striking it rich. Others discussed plans to leave. Many simply enjoyed a brief opportunity to rest. Food became one of the few comforts available in an otherwise difficult environment. As railroads expanded and transportation improved, mining camps gained better access to fresh foods. Markets appeared, restaurants opened, supply deliveries became more reliable. Yet beans remained a staple. They were too useful to disappear, too affordable, too dependable. Even as fortunes were made and towns grew larger, camp beans continued feeding workers throughout the American West. Today they may seem humble, perhaps even boring, yet their historical importance cannot be overstated. For generations of miners, beans represented something essential, a reliable meal waiting at the end of a hard day, a source of strength during difficult times, a reminder that survival often depends less on luxury and more on consistency. Gold may have built the mining camps, silver may have attracted the crowds, but beans helped keep them alive. And for countless miners who spent their lives chasing fortunes beneath the mountains, that simple meal was worth more than many people realize.
Not every food in America's mining camps required hours of preparation. Some meals existed because people needed something fast, something cheap, something filling, and few foods met those requirements better than Johnnycake. At first glance, Johnnycake seems almost too simple to matter. The basic recipe often required little more than cornmeal, water, and a small amount of salt. Mixed together and cooked on a hot surface, it produced a dense, hearty bread that could be prepared almost anywhere. Yet simplicity was exactly what made it valuable. Mining camps rarely enjoyed stable supply chains. A wagon carrying flour might arrive late. Fresh food might disappear entirely. But cornmeal was relatively inexpensive, easy to transport, and capable of lasting for long periods. For camp cooks trying to feed dozens of workers, those qualities mattered enormously. The origins of Johnnycake stretch long before the great mining booms of the American West. Versions of cornmeal cakes were prepared by Native Americans centuries before European settlers arrived. Over time, colonists adopted and modified these recipes. Different regions developed their own variations. By the 19th century, Johnnycake had become familiar throughout much of the United States. When miners headed west in search of gold and silver, they brought those traditions with them. The recipe adapted perfectly for frontier life. A miner didn't need an oven. He didn't need complicated equipment. A cast-iron skillet placed over a fire was often enough. Within minutes, a batch of Johnnycakes could be ready to eat. That convenience proved especially useful during busy periods. Mining camps often operated around the clock. Some workers left before sunrise, others returned late at night. Food needed to be available quickly. Johnnycake helped meet that demand. Many miners ate it alongside beans, salt pork, or stew. Others spread molasses on top when they could afford it. Some preferred it plain. Regardless of how it was served, the goal remained the same: provide energy, provide calories, provide enough nourishment to keep working. And work was relentless. The romantic image of prospectors striking gold often hides the reality of daily life in mining camps. Most miners never became wealthy. Many struggled financially. Some spent years chasing discoveries that never came. Under those circumstances, inexpensive foods became essential. Johnnycake represented exactly the kind of practical meal that frontier workers depended upon.
Camp cooks appreciated it for another reason as well. It could be stretched. A relatively small amount of cornmeal could produce food for many people. That mattered when supply deliveries were delayed or camp populations suddenly increased. Mining towns could grow rapidly after major discoveries. Hundreds of newcomers might arrive in a matter of days. Keeping everyone fed required flexibility. Johnnycake offered that flexibility. As America's transportation networks improved, many frontier foods began fading from everyday life. Railroads delivered fresh products, commercial bakeries expanded, new options appeared. The practical necessity of foods like Johnnycake slowly declined. Yet the recipe survived, partly because it was simple, partly because it tasted good, and partly because it remained connected to an important chapter of American history. Today, versions of Johnnycake continue appearing throughout different regions of the United States. The ingredients may vary, the preparation methods may change, but the spirit remains the same. A humble meal created from basic ingredients. A reminder that some of the most important foods in American history were not created in luxury kitchens. They were created wherever hard-working people needed a dependable meal. For the miners of the American West, Johnnycake was never intended to impress anyone. It wasn't fashionable, it wasn't expensive, it wasn't celebrated. Yet day after day, year after year, it helped feed the workers who built mining camps across the frontier. And sometimes, the simplest foods leave the deepest mark in history.
At the end of a long day in a mining camp, few things mattered more than a hot meal. The sun would disappear behind the mountains. Tools would finally be set aside. The noise of hammers and drills would fade, and hungry workers would begin gathering around the cookhouse. This was the moment many miners looked forward to most, not because they expected luxury, but because they expected comfort. And few foods provided comfort better than miners' stew. Unlike many frontier foods, miners' stew was not defined by a single recipe. In fact, no two camps prepared it exactly the same way. The ingredients depended entirely on what happened to be available. One week the stew might contain salt pork. Another week it might contain beef. Sometimes beans played a major role, sometimes potatoes, sometimes onions. Occasionally, fresh vegetables found their way into the pot. Whatever ingredients the cook could obtain usually became part of the meal. That flexibility was precisely why the dish became so common. Mining camps were unpredictable places. Supply deliveries arrived irregularly. Weather interrupted transportation. Prices fluctuated constantly. A successful cook needed to adapt. Stew made adaptation possible. Almost any ingredient could be stretched to feed a large number of people. A little meat, a few vegetables, some beans, water, time. Together, they became dinner. The cooking process often lasted for hours. Large cast-iron kettles sat above open fires while ingredients slowly simmered together. The aroma spread throughout camp long before the meal was ready. Miners returning from work could smell supper before they reached the cookhouse. For men who had spent the day underground or breaking rock in the sun, that smell often became one of the best parts of the day. Mining was exhausting work. Every meal needed to replace energy that had been spent during long shifts. Stew excelled at that task. It was filling, it was warm, and perhaps most importantly, it brought people together. Unlike quick meals eaten alone, stew encouraged gathering. Workers sat together at long tables. They shared stories, talked about new discoveries, complained about difficult supervisors,
discussed rumors spreading through camp. Food became the center of community life. This social role was just as important as the nutritional one. Life in mining camps could be lonely. Many workers lived far from family. Some traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles from home. The cookhouse provided a rare sense of belonging. For a short time each evening, miners stopped being competitors chasing fortunes and became members of the same community. A good meal helped create that feeling. Some mining camps became famous for their cooks. New arrivals often asked about food quality before asking about wages. That might seem surprising, yet experienced miners understood something important. A camp with a good cook was often a better place to live. Food influenced morale, and morale influenced everything else. A camp where workers ate well tended to function better. A camp with poor food often faced constant complaints. The cook's job was rarely easy. He had to feed large numbers of people with limited resources. He had to manage costs, and he had to satisfy workers whose expectations often exceeded reality. When he succeeded, the entire camp benefited. As the decades passed, many mining camps disappeared. Gold veins ran dry, silver prices collapsed, workers moved elsewhere. Entire towns were abandoned. Yet the food traditions they created left a lasting legacy. Miners' stew became part of the larger story of frontier cooking, a story defined not by luxury, but by practicality, not by abundance, but by resourcefulness. Today, it is easy to overlook foods like miners' stew. They lack the glamour of famous restaurant dishes. They were never designed to impress. Their purpose was simpler: feed hungry people, keep workers going, provide comfort in difficult places. And perhaps that is why they deserve to be remembered. Because the history of America was not built only by wealthy businessmen or famous politicians. It was also built by ordinary workers, men and women who labored in remote camps, endured harsh conditions, and relied on simple meals to get through another day. Salt pork, sourdough bread, camp beans, Johnnycake, miner's stew. 5 humble foods that helped sustain America's mining camps. 5 reminders that history is often found not only in great events, but also in the meals people shared at the end of a hard day's work.